For many, it's the perfect model, the country that has managed to tightly control its borders. It has even gone to the extent of setting up controversial immigration detention centers on remote Pacific islands. That said, at the same time, it's one of the countries with the most immigrants in the world. In fact, half of Australians these days say there is already an excess of foreigners in the country, that there are too many. Pay close attention to everything we're about to tell you, because this could be a major testing ground for the rest of the world. The year is 1949. A ship approaches the Australian coast, packed to the brim with European immigrants. Italians, Greeks, Britons, Poles. People coming from a Europe that still reeked of rubble, rationing, and suitcases packed in a hurry. The question is, what did Australia do at that time? Did it shut the door on them? Did it send them back out to sea? Did it send them to a remote island in the Pacific? Well, no. As I'm sure you've all guessed, not only did it not turn them away, but it did exactly the opposite. It rolled out the red carpet for them. What's more, for decades, Canberra subsidised the journey of thousands upon thousands of European immigrants. Many Britons were called £10 POMs, a reference to the £10 fare, which was the discounted price for travelling to the other side of the world. And keep in mind, this is no trivial matter. It's basically Australia's DNA, because this is a country literally built on immigration, and for years, the government actively promoted it. Which made perfect sense. Just think. This is a gigantic country that even today is practically empty. Australia is a territory 15 times larger than Spain, but with just over half its population. And not surprisingly, decades ago, the situation was even more extreme. So for nearly a century, the government had one obsession: bringing in more people. And that's not just a figure of speech. In fact, today, almost a century after those posters we saw, 1 in 3 Australians was born abroad. It's one of the highest rates in the world. Comparing again to Spain, despite the immigration and boom of recent years, that figure remains at 20%. 1 in 5 residents was born abroad. That is a high number, but nearly 40% lower than Australia's. And on top of that, if we take the second generation into account, the reality in Australia is staggering. Basically, there are very few Australians in the country who are more than 3 generations removed from their arrival. And do you know what the biggest paradox of all is? That, even though the land of kangaroos and giant spiders was built by importing people and subsidizing their travel to fill its cities and work its mines and farms, and despite having one of the highest immigration rates in the world, it's also the country that many in Europe look up to with admiration, saying that's the country that really knew how to control its border. Take a look at this news story.
EU strikes migration deal for more deportations and detention centers abroad.
We recently covered this here on VisualPolitik. We told you how the European Union has just pushed through its new return regulation. And prior to Brussels, this was something that had been implemented in Rome and London, where they even launched a massive initiative to deport immigrants to Rwanda. The plan was a colossal failure, but the point is that all these policies are inspired by Australia. In fact, the British even copied their slogan, "Stop the boats." What's more, they hired a former Australian minister, Alexander Downer, as an advisor to teach them in person exactly how to pull all this off. Even Denmark sent its officials on a 13,000-kilometre trip to see with their own eyes Australia's regional processing centres on the island of Nauru. The problem? That's not the entire story. While it's true Australia has had a very strict immigration policy for years, it hasn't calmed the waters. In fact, the immigration debate is more heated than ever. The debate is no longer about boats arriving loaded with undocumented immigrants. Now it's about housing, visas, international students, overburdened courts, and a rather uncomfortable question: can a country need immigrants and, at the same time, not know what to do with them? More and more Australians believe that immigration numbers are too high. The outcome? One Nation, a conservative, ultra-nationalist party that for decades was treated as the black sheep of parliament, has reached levels of support once considered unthinkable.
One Nation takes primary vote lead in news poll as Albanese's ratings slump to record low.
What's more, I don't know if you remember, but in December 2025, the Bondi Beach attack took place. The worst mass shooting in Australia in 3 decades, and the deadliest jihadist attack in the country's recent history. It was a tragic event that left 16 dead and 40 injured, and further further fueled a conversation that was already highly charged. Well, since it appears that Europe wants to be like Australia because it believes Australia has solved the immigration problem, and given that Australia is considered one of the clearest examples of a hardline immigration policy in the world, here on VisualPolitik we have been asking several questions. First, was Australia really successful with its detention centres on remote Pacific islands? Second, if it went so well, why is the Australian immigration debate, far from dying down, raging more fiercely than ever? And third, what's going on inside a country that desperately needs its immigrants but has lost the ability to manage them? Well, today we're flying to the land of koalas, kangaroos, and people who seem far too relaxed about living alongside some of the world's most dangerous creatures, a combination that ultimately turned Crocodile Dundee into a national hero. A country that we on VisualPolitik are lucky enough to know and love. Although, to be honest, there's one mystery we still haven't managed to solve: how anyone can actually enjoy Vegemite. So get ready, buckle up, because this time the trip is a long one. Let's head to the antipodes. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, well, I've got some good news for you. At Visual Factory, we have created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because, of course, if you want to invest your money so you're no longer at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge through the link below, and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain, in a clear and simple way, the most essential investment concepts, what multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. Oh, and by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better, since we send each episode of the series by email and every edition is unique. If you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get back into the video. The story that's been told in many parts of Europe is very simple. Australia had a huge problem with refugee boats, set up a few camps on some Pacific islands, and the boats suddenly stopped coming. Deterrence in its purest form. And guess what? If you take a quick look at the numbers, it seems that this is absolutely true. Take a look at this data. In 2001, 5,516 people arrived in Australia by boat, and the following year, only one arrived. What on earth happened in between to cause such a drastic change? Well, in order to understand it, we have to go all the way back to August 2001. An old, overloaded Indonesian fishing boat carrying 433 Afghan asylum seekers began to sink in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Fortunately, the MV Tampa, a Norwegian cargo ship that happened to be passing by, was able to rescue them and set course for Christmas Island, a small Australian territory off the coast of Indonesia. And do you know what the Australian government, led at the time by the Conservative John Howard, did? It closed its doors. It denied the ship entry into Australian waters, and when the Tampa attempted to enter, despite the ban, the government ended up sending elite Navy commandos to board the Norwegian ship by force and prevent the asylum seekers from setting foot in the country. As you can imagine, it sparked a massive scandal that made headlines around the world, but it was also a masterstroke. Because the fact is that 77% of Australians supported Howard's decision, nearly 8 out of 10. And Howard, who was on the eve of an election, realised instantly that he had just struck electoral gold. And with that gold, he put together his grand plan, which he called the Pacific Solution. A three-pronged plan designed to put an end once and for all to the arrival of illegal immigrants by sea. The first was what they called the Split. The government took Christmas Island and other remote islands and removed them from Australia's migration zone. What did that mean? Well, it meant that arriving on those islands no longer legally counted as arriving in Australia. A crucial move, because in order to apply for asylum, you need to set foot in the country. Then, the second part of the plan was to approve extraterritorial processing. In other words, instead of processing asylum claims within Australia, they would be processed outside the country, in another nation. Where exactly? Well, in two tiny remote places. The small island nation of Nauru, a speck in the middle of the Pacific, and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, a country located just north of Australia. There they set up facilities somewhere between refugee camps and detention centres, where they held anyone who tried to arrive by boat while their case was being reviewed. And the third pillar, possibly the most important of all, even though it made the fewest headlines, was deploying the Navy to intercept boats directly on the high seas. We're talking about Australian military ships patrolling to intercept the small boats before they arrived, and in many cases, escorting them back. Well, on paper, the plan worked. Arrivals dropped from over 5,000 to 1, and Howard swept the 2004 elections. Case closed? Well, no. The Pacific solution never enjoyed political consensus. Left-wing politicians detested this strategy with all its might. So when Labour's Kevin Rudd came to power, he dismantled it in 2008. And do you know what happened as soon as the camps were removed? Well, the boats came back, but not gradually, no. Arrivals increased 17-fold in 2009, and the numbers kept rising until 2012 and 2013, when they surpassed all-time highs. By 2013, Australia was already receiving more than 25,000 people by boat. The government, led at the time by Labour's Julia Gillard, panicked and decided to do exactly what the European playbook would recommend today. In 2012, it reopened the offshore detention centres. It reopened Nauru, reopened Manus, and began sending people back to the islands. But guess what? This time, the strategy didn't work. In the 6 months following the reopening of the centres, 10,000 more people arrived by boat. The facilities became overcrowded within weeks. And not only did the arrivals not stop, but they reached record highs right after the camps were reopened. And the question is, why did the same measure work in 2001 but fail in 2012? Well, for several reasons. First, because the immigrants who boarded those boats did the maths, and the numbers added up for them. The camps were so overcrowded that, of the approximately 20,000 who arrived during that period, only about 1,000 were sent to the islands. Second, they also took into account the issue of resettlement. Nearly 70% of those sent to those camps during the first Pacific solution ended up, sooner or later, living in Australia or another developed country. And third, because perhaps the camps weren't even that important.
If you attempt an illegal maritime venture, you will fail. You'll be either turned back, returned to your country of origin, or transferred to regional processing. You will never settle in Australia. You have zero chance of success.
In September 2013, Conservative Tony Abbott came to power with a promise to take an even tougher stance. To that end, he launched a major operation dubbed Operation Border Sovereignty. He kept the camps on the islands, yes, but the focus of the strategy shifted to pushbacks at sea. The Australian Navy stopped merely escorting boats to the camps and began, instead, turning them around on the high seas and pushing them back toward Indonesian waters, which was where they had come from. To give you an idea, when a boat was too dilapidated to make the return trip, they would put everyone into sturdy orange lifeboats, built solely for this purpose, and send them back. The result? In 2014, only one boat managed to reach Australia, and after that, none. 0 arrivals for nearly a decade. It was a more efficient operation. In other words, control of the waters and automatic turnbacks were the key deterrent. In other words, the mere idea that setting out on the journey to reach Australia was pointless. That's what caused these crossings to disappear. There was no need to turn back a lot of migrants. The boats had simply disappeared. And yet, Europe is now relying primarily on offshore centres. Why? For one reason. Offshore centres are much more convenient. You send people to a distant island and, as they say, out of sight, out of mind. In contrast, pushbacks at sea are more complicated. They require mobilizing military and police resources. The risk of an accident is higher, and for that reason they tend to be less popular. Be that as it may, the fact is that even with these measures, as we've seen, the immigration debate hasn't gone away. Some immigrants continue to arrive by air, and above all, legal immigration also sparks major controversies. Sometimes this is more justified, and other times less so.
Do we really want to see Sharia law? Do we want to see multiple marriages? Do we want to see these gangs getting around our streets with machetes? That's not the Australian way of life.
Australia is facing a severe housing crisis. Despite being a sparsely populated country, housing prices are sky high, and on top of that, they still need a lot of immigrants. This leads to a great deal of social and economic friction, and that hasn't gone away. Why? Let's take a look. Let's go back for a moment to that ship we mentioned at the very beginning of this video. In the mid-20th century, Australia was, quite simply, terrified. It had just witnessed the fall of Singapore during World War II. The Japanese had bombed the city of Darwin, and suddenly its leaders realised something chilling. They had the 6th largest country in the world, and almost no one to defend it, or help it grow. In that context, a vast territory could actually be a huge weakness. That's why they subsidised plane tickets. That's why they implemented a highly attractive and accommodating immigration policy, though of course, not for everyone. Even when racial discrimination was rampant in Australia and the White Australia policy was in place, the question was never, immigration, yes or no. The question was always a very different one. What kind of immigrants do we want? Keep this in mind. Australia didn't turn off the tap. What it did was filter the flow. The idea was essentially to bring in immigrants who would reproduce on Australian soil, the culture and way of life of much of Europe. Of course, over time, that filter changed. The country moved beyond white Australia, opened up to Asia, and made skilled immigration a central economic tool. The fact is, without immigration, the country simply wouldn't have functioned. And obviously, as European countries rebuilt and grew wealthier after World War II, attracting immigrants from them became increasingly difficult. Since then, Australia has focused primarily on bringing in people from around the world to keep its economy running. For instance, do you know what Australia's 4th largest export is? Behind mining giants like iron, coal and gas, education. That is, attracting international students. A different but significant type of immigration. Because those hundreds of thousands of young people who come from all over the world to pay tuition at Australian universities bring more than $50 billion a year into the country. We're talking about spending on college tuition, rent, groceries, transportation, as well as a much larger labour pool and tremendous soft power. Now, this is a very specific example, but in general, there are entire sectors that depend on immigrant labour. Healthcare, construction, mining, and agriculture would fall apart without the influx of new workers. It's a very large country with abundant natural resources and an economic structure that relies heavily on their exploitation. Just look at what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic hit and Australia sealed its borders tight, something happened that hadn't occurred since World War II. For the first time in 80 years, net migration turned negative. The result? All the alarm bells went off. Economic activity began to run out of steam. But if the country has illegal immigration under control, and also needs immigration for the economy to function, how do we explain that right now half of Australians say there are too many immigrants? Why does the debate continue? What explains one nation leading the polls for the first time in its history? Well, because the model, from the inside, may have begun to crack. The cost of living has skyrocketed. Inflation remains stubbornly high at 4%, and to top it all off, even though the economy continues to grow, we've already seen per capita GDP dip into negative territory. And above all, interest rates and high housing prices are making life an uphill battle for many.
First-time homebuyers hesitate as the average home in Australia passes $1 million.
Supply constraints and strong demand have sent real estate prices soaring. And who does a large part of the country point to as the main culprit behind all this? Well, obviously, immigration. Net migration is at record high levels. Between 300,000 and 600,000 people are arriving each year, which, considering the country's population, is a very high percentage. For many, it's a veritable invasion, which clearly is causing rents, home prices, and prices in general to skyrocket. At the same time, hospitals, roads, schools, everything is starting to become overwhelmed. But what has changed in this haven of immigration to suddenly lead to this outcome? Well, basically, people stopped leaving. Net migration is a subtraction, those coming in minus those leaving. The record in Australia wasn't shattered because a flood of new people came in, but because those who would normally have left, particularly students and temporary workers, stayed in the country. Between June 2020 and June 2023, there were 334,000 fewer migrant departures than expected. And here we must make an important point. In Australia, there are actually two very different immigration systems coexisting. On the one hand, there is permanent immigration, those who arrive to stay in full compliance with the law. This is extremely tightly controlled. The government sets a quota of about 185,000 spots per year and has stuck to that figure for an entire decade. There's absolutely no lack of control there. It's a very high number, but not out of control either. On the other hand, however, there is temporary immigration, and that's where the real bomb lies.
Temporary visa holders in Australia surged to record 2.9 million, 10% of population.
An all-time record. We're talking about international students, recent graduates, temporary workers, people on working holiday visas, a flood of people who, in theory, are just passing through. So what's the problem? Well, many of these temporary residents don't leave. They get stuck in a kind of legal limbo that drags on for years. And how does this limbo drag on? Through a loophole that has almost become a national pastime. Your student visa is about to expire. What do? You switch to another visa. What if they deny it? You appeal to the courts. And while the court decides your appeal, they give you a bridging visa, which allows you to legally remain in the country. What if that fails too? Well, you apply for asylum, not because you're fleeing a war, but as a last-ditch effort to scrape together a few more months. Each step of the process buys you extra time in Australia. The result, more than 432,000 people are currently stuck on these bridging visas. To give you an idea, that's more than 1 in every 100 people in all of Australia living in administrative limbo. On top of that, there are more than 100,000 people who were denied asylum and yet remain in the country. Of those, about 50,000 have exhausted absolutely all avenues of appeal and still haven't left. Why would they leave a country with such a high standard of living? Ultimately, Australia built an economy that requires high levels of immigration to function, but it failed to prepare the country to absorb those people. We could say that Australia's problem isn't one of quantity, it's primarily one of integration. And this is important because it's primarily a matter of public policy, which explains the rise of parties like One Nation that we saw earlier. But strict control of illegal immigration did achieve one thing: a massive social consensus in favor of legal migration. If this consensus is now eroding, it's due to excesses that have been poorly managed by the system itself. But in any case, this does not mean that the majority of the country rejects immigration. Rather, it simply wants to limit it, which is not the same thing. To summarise, the example of Australia shows us that, first, border control is feasible and can foster social consensus. Second, such control is not bad for immigration. In fact, it can even facilitate the establishment of legal mechanisms that are far more successful. Third, we mustn't go too far. Whether legal or illegal, immigration will always have a significant local impact. If things are done right, the impact can be very positive. If done poorly, the entire model could collapse. That said, the question is, what do you think of Australia's experience? What would you adopt in your country, and what would you discard? Leave your thoughts in the comments and let's start a discussion. Remember, if you really want to understand what's happening in the markets and learn how to manage your money with more confidence, then join the Visual Factory Club. It's completely free and the link's in the description. And now if you found this video interesting, give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already. These small gestures help us out a lot. As always, thank you for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.